Welcome to Often Wrong. On today's episode, we will be discussing the impact of environmental disasters and also talking a little bit about Claire's most recent experience with the LA wildfires. Also for you today, we have a fantastic interview with Dr. Meiburg, former acting deputy administrator of the EPA, who told us how we might be wrong in our reactions and our preparations and offered what we could be doing instead. So with that said, let's get to the episode. Hi, people. Thank you so much for listening. We love bringing you these conversations with experts that we think you should know and remind you all that it's okay to be wrong because we model this for you every single week right here on this podcast. Please be sure to subscribe to our channel, like this episode, and most importantly, hit that notification bell to stay up to date for when the next episode is live. The more of you that engage, the better guests we can get. So honestly, this is for you, not for us. Thank you. Let's get into it. Welcome to Often Wrong, the podcast featuring social impact experts who turn being wrong into an exploration of the middle and a chance to maybe get it right. In a world obsessed with being right, we flip the script on the hard questions and dig into divisive topics like, is social media activism? Or is any given problem the left's fault or the right's fault? Spoiler alert, it's both. We might get canceled, but at least we'll know why. Oh, we're so sorry. Oh my God, we are listening and learning, I promise. All right, hi everybody, welcome back. I'm Lisa Nwankwo.
And I'm Claire Cornetta.
And this is Often
Wrong. That was so cute of us. I like
know,
that.
We're adorable. Today's episode is serious. Today's episode is about environmental disasters, which Claire said something to me really interesting earlier today about originally this episode was called Natural Disasters. And instead we called it Environmental Disasters. Why did we do that, Claire?
Because natural has an implication that it is normal and occurring like always. And with the implication of climate change, the implications of climate change, I think it's better specified as environmental disasters, environmental catastrophes, because even though things like wildfires, hurricanes are, even seismic events, earthquakes, etc., they are a part of our Earth's history and something that definitely things that are very naturally occurring. The scope, scale, destruction, frequency, etc., is all affected and exacerbated by climate change. For all of those things, earthquakes, I actually had no idea that was impacted by climate change. We should do
I had no idea till you just said that.
It is actually. Wow. Yeah, something about the actually it's fracking. Drilling into the earth
that makes so much sense.
Contributing to destabilizing our tectonic plates. Check me on that, audience. But yeah, it's fracking that is, which I would consider, obviously part of how we've been changing the climate.
Which means that some of these are unnatural disasters.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah. So yeah, today's episode is about environmental disasters and how we talk about them before, after, during, etc. I think it's such a rich topic. There's no shortage of things to talk about when it comes to environmental disasters, but I'm particularly, and on this podcast, interested in exploring the ways that we engage in discourse around it and,
totally.
All of the little things that contribute to the conversations being had at every level, individual, interpersonal, and then, in the media.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm really very excited for our guest today. But it's a pertinent topic. It will never stop being a pertinent topic, at least, in our lifetimes. But
yeah. And I think I will also say this episode is coming on the heels of the California, Los Angeles wildfires. So
yes, it is.
I think it unfortunately is a good time to have this conversation. And I think it's going to continue being a good time to have this conversation. Yeah. And I'm glad to be having it here with someone like our guest today. So
yes. Yeah, me too.
But before we get into it, how are you doing?
I've been sick all week. I'm cold and I'm sad,
Yeah.
but I'm here.
Yeah. I think for our
Profound.
audience to know, I think it is helpful for them to know that you live in LA.
Yes, I do. I do live in Los Angeles. I'm in Southern California. And yeah, it's a profound experience knowing people, caring about people, watching them lose their homes, but also just from a, you know, perspective of someone who's lived in this city. I moved to Los Angeles in 2019 and it just hurts seeing the destruction. And I'm thinking so much about our ecology in LA, which is so diverse and, has so many influences. And there have been, the scale of the fires all over the city is just, it's still hard for me to get my mind around. And I think it probably will be for a long time. But, I'm hopeful about the community efforts to rebuild. I've been heartened by a lot of people who, have been working really hard to, you know, through mutual aid, through just even one-off things. I know like certain subsets of communities are mobilizing. I've been really interested to see how realtors, for example, are like working diligently to help displaced folks. It's really I think whenever there's an environmental disaster, you get to see the best and worst of humanity, like the people who are looting, for instance, and then the people who are spending all their waking hours trying to help their fellow community members. So yeah, that's my check-in. How are you, Lisa?
I feel like I'm in this cycle that has been going on for so long now. If you're a TikTok user, also we're in the moment where we might not have TikTok anymore. But one thing that I think everyone on it knows is that Bo Burnham song where he says, "There it is again, that funny feeling." Exactly that. I feel like it's constant. There's so many things that have happened over the past couple of years in our own backyards, not to mention the rest of the world. And it just feels, I'm just genuinely tired of being unsure of what to do and kind of how the response is always like, the politicians say nothing. And then everyone posts on their Instagram about the thing. And then it's like, well, is this helpful? Like, what happens now? And I think that's a big question I want to ask today of just, we've been hearing for a long time of how you can like decrease your, what's it called? Like your carbon footprint, which
Mm-hmm.
by the way is, corporation propaganda.
Yes, it
But
is. Thank you.
it also, it's like
Falsehood
we
of
hear
individual
these,
responsibility. Thank you.
yeah, it's like you're spending so much time being like, oh, I'm going to conserve water. I'm going to do all these things, which you should do. Those are lovely things to
Sure.
do.
Yeah.
But this is how to prevent climate change. Climate change already happened. We're already here. What do we do now? And
Yeah.
how do we take care of each other and
Yeah.
ourselves when other people are not?
Yes.
It also reminds me, and yeah, this week is just, yeah, there's so many things going on. I'm getting married soon. And it just reminds me, I was thinking about this article that I read, I think in 2020, and it was just a opinion piece about a person of like how it is when you're living through something like a war. And I thought that was really interesting because it's like, you'll still go to the bar. You're going to go to happy hour. You're going to go to work. You're going to argue with your partner. You're going to call your mom on the phone. And I just think that's so real because I think maybe other people feel this way when you see like catastrophes like this happen on the news and it feels weird to continue with your life the way that it always was. But then you also kind of have to. It's not super
Yeah.
helpful to stop. So
Totally. I think
that's
that's
on my mind.
well, thank you for saying that. Yeah, you have a lot coming up going on, all the things. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think going right into it, you know, it's interesting because when the fires first started, so last oh, when the fires first kind of started happening, it was like one day and there was one fire, and then all of a sudden there was another fire, and then a bunch more just kept popping up. But the day after, my friend called me and was like, yeah, there are people, we're like 2 miles from the fires, and like people are asking me if I want to go play tennis with them. And we were both like, what? Like, I don't understand how. And then I was like, oh, it's a cognitive dissonance. It's just like something catastrophic happens and you can't even go there. Like I've had this plenty of times where something horrific happens and I'm just like in my own compartmentalized world, and it's not that it doesn't register. It's just like, oh, but why wouldn't I do this? It's not ignorant. It's just like almost force of habit, but also I think, to be honest, the closest I've felt, and I grew up in Colorado, I've had wildfires around my whole life. So like I'm more well versed in, what to do when a wildfire comes or breaks out. And so but in California, like I've never experienced anything like this, that it was such a wide scale evacuation. And for the record, no one has experienced anything like this in Los Angeles. This is the most devastating, wildfire in LA's history. And, I'm sure we'll get all the robust statistics at some point, but it's been unprecedented in a lot of ways. But it was just kind of like so similar to me to the pandemic. When the pandemic broke out, whatever, it was like March 13th, 12th, 8th, something like that, that all of a sudden everything changed overnight and people were like, oh, I can't travel? Like, do I travel? And I think there was a moment there, like I remember going to Whole Foods and stocking up and being like, great. And there were probably 400 people at Whole Foods and we were all like in close quarters, and which is the worst thing. But it was like, oh, just in case, we have to take off work next week or whatever, like not sure what's going to happen. And this has kind of felt like in similar ways, like just unprecedented. Like, what do we do? Like what's normal? What's okay? And I mean, even thinking about like going to an event with friends, like I was like, is that even going to happen? Is that like, should it happen? What's appropriate here? I don't even know, and it's ended up just feeling very, very novel to me, but similar to how the pandemic felt.
Yeah. I mean, I wonder, honestly, we've been in a series of unprecedented events for several years now. Yeah. And it really starts to feel like, to me, like, what are you supposed to do? Like, is there a mourning period? Is there like are we supposed to have a wake every time this happens? Yeah. Or is this like just increasingly, I don't know, just a continuing class in how to continue living your life and incorporating these moments into them? Right. Because I mean, it's also different. Like, same thing with the pandemic, depending on where you are, it's different. Mm-hmm. Like, I was in New York City, very different than my family in the Philadelphia suburbs, even just they were a few hours away, but our experiences were completely different, and how people acted and how we related to each other. But it also, I'm thinking a lot too about, I mean, obviously the LA wildfires are at the forefront right now, but we've had so much in the last couple of years. Off the top of my head, most recently we had the hurricane in Asheville, North Carolina. We had the train derailment and the water poisoning in East Palestine, Ohio. We had a similar one very shortly after that in Philadelphia. I was in Philadelphia at that time. Then the Canada wildfires that made everyone on like the northeast coast area have red skies and terrible air quality for like a week or so. And it's just it's so crazy. Like, what, I just feel like this isn't the beginning of anything. I feel like we've been in this for a long time, but it does feel to me that this is unfortunately not the end, and that we're probably going to see a lot more of this. And I think it's about time that we start figuring out what to do when that happens.
Yeah. Well, and I think, going back to your point about like, what do we do? How do we, like, is it just a lesson in carrying on or, adapting? What does that look like? And I think I am brought to, we need to just allow everyone to have their own reactions. And, like, again, what this podcast is all about, we don't want people to be vilified for having one reaction or another, like sometimes, yes, there are insensitive things. Duh. There were some all-time examples with
Vanessa
the
Hudgens
LA wildfires. Yeah.
in the pandemic.
Yeah. And, but like for me, it's about, okay, well, process it, have your reaction and also recognize that you're not going to have a reaction, then be done with it. Like, it's going to hit me when I'm, driving back into LA and looking at all the burn scars and, the ongoing fires, all of that. That is an experience that, again, it touches everyone differently, but how do we have enough of a community and a strong enough base to support each other through that? And, also not take it out on each other where it's not needed,
Well, is that not the point of this whole podcast? It's
Exactly.
your reaction is going to change the whole time. There's
Yep.
nothing wrong with being wrong. Like,
Yep.
I don't even know it's unprecedented. We don't even know what wrong is at this point. And honestly, to
Yep.
this day, it's 2025. Literally last night, I thought about lockdown and had
Yeah.
a new perspective on it. So it's
Yeah.
just going to continue forever. And
Yeah.
there's something to be said for just being able to have that understanding of each other, that
Yeah.
the goal is not to respond correctly to the environmental disaster.
100%.
Like mentally or like philosophically.
Yes.
It doesn't.
100%. Like, I'll give an example of this. The other day, so one of my friends who evacuated was staying with me outside, about 2 hours outside of LA, which is where I am right now. And we were like, oh my God, fire pod. Like, it's kind of like our pod, like our COVID pod, but like fire pod. And obviously, like, we weren't able to go back into the city for numerous reasons. The Sunset Fire broke out like 2 minutes from his house and he left, thankfully. But like, the air quality has been horrific. And that is, to me, in and of itself, a good enough reason to evacuate if you have the means and desire to. Obviously, not everyone is in that boat, but he was with me, and we were kind of like, haha, fire pod. And I was like, oh, I feel odd. Should I feel funny about making a joke like that? And I'm like, it's not really. We're kind of,
You are a fire pod. And
he's
also
displaced.
Yeah.
Like,
and not saying fire pod didn't
wouldn't
unburn
have done anything. Yes.
the land.
Yes.
So
That's true. Yeah, exactly. There was no harm done. And honestly, I think I would love to explore some of the themes of like comedy in, the worst times of our lives, because levity, comedy, like just laughter, connectedness, anything that brings you connectedness in times like this, to me, is wonderful.
Yeah.
And whatever that looks like, if you need to connect to your community, to others, to people outside your community, to, the land itself, like whatever that looks like for you is what should happen. So yes, my fire pod lives on, and I did not need to feel any kind of shame around, making myself chuckle in light of, or
you shouldn't.
in the
I'm
wake
glad
of,
you had a fire pod.
Yeah, me too.
You needed that. And I think
Miss
really
my fire pod.
everything coming together in whatever way, if you're using, nature or your community or your family or anything to cry together or laugh together or make a plan together or volunteer together, the most important part is the together part. And
Yeah,
to me,
absolutely.
but I could
Absolutely.
be wrong. I don't know.
Yeah. And again, I think for me, it just comes back to connectedness. And I think the worst thing that we can do is just ignore the hard feelings, ignore the realities, and just shove it down in ourselves. And, everyone needs to allow themselves that time and that space to process. I mean, even honestly, like everyone, all like my close friends and family outside of LA, all were really emotionally affected by the fires. And it touched me. I was like, thank you, because like, again, in Colorado, we've had some really horrific, devastating wildfires. The Marshall Fire, I mean, that was outside of Boulder, Colorado. But like in the fall, we had two really terrible ones. And it was just kind of like, and I don't even know if there was national attention on it, right? But like, it was heartening to me that not only were people having an emotional reaction, but also, I mean, everyone knows somebody in LA. Like LA's a big, big city and metropolitan area, not really a city, kind of. But people were touched by it and people were checking in, and it was really, nice to feel very human in that moment and in that time. It was just all disillusionment. It was complete. I have no idea. And I mean, you checked in with me, which was very nice. A lot. There were a few cries for help. But other than that,
that's to be expected.
To be expected. Yeah.
I'll have a crash out for no reason. So an environmental disaster is a very good reason.
Yeah.
To me.
It's true. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. And what you don't want to do is not process anything else in your life. And then so when something big and outside of yourself happens, then you process everything else with the thing,
Oh, yeah.
Like when someone, like a distant relative dies and you haven't processed or even dealt with 9 other traumas, and you're like, and it wrecks you. You're like, that doesn't feel like it's just about this.
Yeah, maybe not.
I'm trying to process as I go, which is nice.
That's fun.
Trying to do that, not let it build up. It's slightly working.
Yeah. Well, shall we get into introducing our guest? I'm very excited.
Yes, I would love to. So today we are honored to welcome Dr. Stan Meiburg to Often Wrong. Dr. Meiburg currently serves as the executive director of the Andrew Sabin Family Center for Environment and Sustainability at Wake Forest University in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. His career spans decades of leadership and innovation in environmental protection and sustainability. Dr. Meiburg is perhaps best known for his 39-year career with the EPA, where he capped his service as acting deputy administrator from 2014 to 2017. Over his remarkable tenure, he led efforts to protect our nation's air, water, clean up hazardous and toxic waste sites, build collaborative relationships with state and tribal environmental programs, and ensure sound management within the agency. So we're incredibly grateful to have Dr. Meiburg with us today to discuss how we approach environmental disasters and the discourse surrounding them. His wealth of experience will, I have no doubt, bring vital insights into this important conversations. So welcome, Dr. Meiburg.
Here's some tips and tricks on how to be often wrong from your hosts, Lisa and Claire. First, don't like this podcast. 2, never subscribe to this podcast. And 3, definitely don't hit the notification bell to get notified about new episodes. Once you're done all that, we can get back into the episode.
Well, Stan, thank you so much for being here with us today. We're so excited to have you, and very excited given the relevance of the topic and how sad it is, but also just very excited and heartened to have you. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. I'm very glad to be here.
Today we're talking about environmental disasters and the discourse around them. And, on our podcast, we talk a lot about discourse and what people get wrong about certain subjects and, how we relate to things. But before we dig into that, I would love to hear a little bit about your work and your journey and, what brought you to where you are now.
Well, Claire, thank you very much. And as may have been covered in the introduction. I am here at Wake Forest University as the executive director of the Sabin Center for Environment and Sustainability. And what brought me to this spot are a couple of things. One is I actually am a Wake Forest alumnus, and so when the rest of my other career ended up, I was very fortunate to end up back here at the university. But most of my experience that's related to this topic comes from my work with the Environmental Protection Agency. I started in the long ago year of 1977 as a student assistant and ended up working at EPA for 39 years in a variety of positions from Washington to Research Triangle Park to Dallas to Atlanta, and then a long period in Atlanta, and then wound up in Washington as the acting deputy administrator as the final chapter in my career until 2017. So in the course of that experience, we witnessed a lot of disasters of many different styles. Train derailments, hurricanes, a massive coal ash spill, and you got from that experience, or from those incidents, a lot of experience in how people think about disasters and ways in which you can try to cope and respond. I will say that EPA, it's not generally appreciated, rather, that EPA is often involved in response to disasters of this type, that people think of EPA as a regulatory agency, and that's true. But EPA has staff who are always involved in responding to things, and that includes the Los Angeles fire, where there are EPA staff working there now helping to clean up hazardous waste and other residuals from the fires itself. So this is a real ongoing thing and an important responsibility of EPA.
Yeah, that's great to know. What a career, Stan. Well, thank you. We're just honored that you're here talking with us today. Thanks.
Yeah, honestly, it's so cool. I feel like there's something really interesting for me speaking to you right now, because we always hear about the EPA, but you don't really get to put a face on it a lot of times if you're just, walking around the world.
Well, and I will say that's a standing joke. I often was, when I would go out and talk to people, I said that was part of my job, to be a face for EPA, because they are seen as faceless bureaucrats, and you need a face. And the standing joke was that if I had known I was going to be a face for EPA, I would have asked for a better face. I would have asked for Robert Redford instead. The one I was most usually compared to was Chuck Norris.
Honestly,
that was a while back.
That one works.
Yeah, honestly, I kind of like that. And being the Chuck Norris of environmental protection, I think there could be worse things, Stan. Yeah, that's pretty cool.
It depends.
Well, you have this storied career. I'm so excited to dig into this wealth of knowledge that you have. But because this is often wrong, we have to ask the question. Throughout your career, is there something that you can say in hindsight that you got so wrong about, whether it's environmental disasters or really just anything in your career that you know now?
Well, I don't know that I want to disclose everything that occurred, but I will say that there were three things that I really look back on and think, boy, those were mistakes. And one was a policy question in the development of the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. One of the ideas was to introduce an additive to gasoline called methyl tertiary butyl ether. And the theory was that you had a lot of this stuff available, it could be made pretty cheaply, and it increased the oxygen content of fuels, making them burn in cars more cleanly. And so we built in a requirement to use MTBE in reformulated gasoline to help clean up the air. Well, what could go wrong? And the answer of what could go wrong is MTBE is in fact flows very easily through groundwater, and so when you had any leaks in underground gasoline tanks, this chemical would go out and get into groundwater systems and drinking water and contaminate pretty significant areas. And recognizing this, then you had to go back and take it out of there and do a lot of cleanup work around leaking gasoline tanks to clean up contamination. Maybe not such a good idea. A second thing, oops. A second thing was back in 2015, there was a spill at a Superfund site that was being worked on by EPA and contractors in the Colorado area, the Gold King mine spill. And these folks were trying to determine whether water had risen up within an abandoned mine, which was pretty an issue about contaminated water in this mine. And so the EPA staff went and started drilling in to try to determine whether or not there was water there. Well, they hadn't really completely thought this through, and when they drilled in, there was not only water there, but it burst through the opening of the mine and created this great plume of water going downhill, and it came across as a big yellow plume of water moving down towards New Mexico. And at the time, I remember thinking, well, this isn't great, but most of that color comes from just picking up dirt as the water flowed downhill, and the level of contamination was really not that severe. And technically, I still think that was true, but what I had underestimated is, facts are facts, but perception of reality, and the perception about that event was driven by the image of this dirty yellow plume moving down the river. And I underestimated the impact that would have on the communities in the area and the political reaction that would produce about folks who just like nothing more than beating up on EPA because here it was EPA contractors were polluting the environment. So that's another example. And then a last one, just on a very personal story. At one point in my career, I was asked if I would go work as a liaison between EPA and the Centers for Disease Control. And at the time, initially, I thought, this is really going to be the end of my career. I'll go off to CDC and never be heard of again at EPA, and this is terrible. I was completely wrong. I actually did it. The good news is I actually did it and discovered it was a tremendously beneficial experience. It was very useful to learn about what life is like in another agency and some of the challenges, and that, in fact, there was a real need for that kind of liaison because folks at CDC and folks at EPA have missions that are very similar in many respects, but they don't have the same culture as an organization or necessarily use the same language. So you had people using the same words to mean different things and different words to mean the same things, and helping to provide that translation and connection and relationship building was actually a great idea. But I didn't think that when I went in. So there are more examples, but those are three that just come immediately to mind.
Those are so good.
That's so good. Stan,
That's
thank
so
you.
Crazy.
That's
Honestly,
so good. And yeah, go ahead, Lisa.
We have another question that goes with this original question of what you got wrong. But honestly, listen, especially the second one. I'm a person who is just, I think, by birth, naturally distrustful of agencies sometimes. And so because of this, I'm really curious about, I don't know, I thought that was a really interesting story for me to hear, because there's always a like, oh, this government agency did this thing evil, like they're polluting, whatever. And so to hear that, like, this was, you were trying to do the right thing, and or from the first story, actually, where you're trying to do the right thing and then something else happened and you learned from it, which is human and normal. And that is actually great learning and how science works. But I don't know, I thought that was like a really good story for me, because that kind of checked how something I might be getting wrong about how some of these agencies are working.
And that, in fact, was exactly my blind spot, a recognition that I work with these immensely talented people all the time, but I underestimate the degree to which people have exactly the reaction you did. Oh, if the government's telling you to do something, then you should do the opposite thing, because who knows what they're thinking. Now, it's occasionally amusing to me to hear stories like this, that people assume that the government has this very meticulously detailed and malicious plot that's involved behind this seemingly innocuous thing. And it assumes that the government is more capable than the government really is.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Yep.
But that building of relationships is not just related to the conveyance of facts. And this is one of the most difficult things about risk communication in any situation, that just simply laying out facts is not enough. It really involves having a relationship that enables people to hear facts, and sometimes even that it matters very much who the communicator is. That I can say a set of facts as an employee of the EPA, for example, and people will sometimes dismiss them. But if their neighbor or somebody who they trust otherwise, and the most trusted class of professionals in America are doctors, if somebody who you trust says the same set of facts, you will listen, and in a completely different way. So it's really not just about the facts, and it's not even just always about the how you communicate. It's who is doing the communicating, and intelligent responsible officials during a crisis are very mindful about this, of putting someone forward as their spokesperson who intrinsically engenders trust.
Yeah. Absolutely. Oh, that was
Wow.
so well said.
Yeah.
And I also just want to touch on your third example with CDC and EPA. I think what a cool opportunity. Lisa and I's faces were both like, oh, that's important. And
No, and in fact, that would be the right reaction. But at the
yeah.
time, I was very nervous about it.
Well, this brought up something for me, and I think, what I immediately thought of was, oh my God, good, we're not siloing these things. Like public health and environment are this, like we can't be doing that. And in light of that story, I would love to ask you, what do you think people get wrong about how they communicate about environmental disasters? And I'm thinking about the siloing effect, but I would love to know, you know, what you're thinking.
Oh, I probably the thing that comes to mind immediately that people get wrong is you want to move too quickly to use words that you really can't substantively defend. You want to assume you
Mm.
know things that people don't. And the most immediate example is never, ever use the word safe, because the word safe means so many different things to different people. And so you will find yourself in trouble if you try to rush too quickly for understandable reasons. You want to reassure people, and safe is a concept that you would think people intrinsically would understand and would help be reassuring. But first of all, you run into that problem that we mentioned earlier, that if the government says it's safe, you think, oh well,
Is
maybe
it?
not so
Yeah.
much.
Yeah.
And we had an example in 2001 where Governor Christie Todd Whitman, who was the administrator at that time, and who was a really, really fine official of integrity, but in the wake of the 9/11 crash, there was all this dust and smoke that occurred from the collapse of the World Trade
Yeah.
Center, and there was all this pressure, I think, on officials to say that things were going to be safe and going to be okay. And she realized later that after sort of trying to, I think, walk that fine line about providing assurance, that maybe that was not quite the right strategy, and it created more anxiety and distrust, especially as information came out later about exposures by firefighters and other people to
Sure.
asbestos-containing materials from the buildings. And so, what I took from that one is probably the biggest one, and the lessons I took from that were that the things you should do is, if you're a spokesperson, that you first have to simply acknowledge the pain, the disruption, the suffering that people are experiencing, with some sense of empathy for people's experience, because they are living it in ways that you're not. And just saying, oh yeah, I understand how you feel. No, you don't. You really don't. But you start from this sense of empathy, which is a lot of which is listening, and then in communicating with people, the first thing you do is you tell people what you know, that you are as transparent as you possibly can be, both with good news and with bad news. Then the second thing is you tell people what you don't know and what you're doing to try to find out, and when you think you will have more information. And then the third thing is, if it is at all possible, give people something to do. And I'll use as an example an incident that occurred here in Winston-Salem at Wake Forest a few years ago, when there was a fire at a fertilizer plant, which was about a mile from the university campus, just north of the campus. And you don't think of Wake Forest, for those who are listening to this podcast, Wake Forest is not a place where you think of in being proximity to any kind of industrial activity, but this fertilizer plant was about a mile north of the campus. And when it caught on fire, it turned out, the fire chief found out that there were 600 tons of ammonium nitrate. Ammonium nitrate is not only highly flammable, in fact, under the right conditions, it can be explosive. And in an event that occurred in 2015 in a fertilizer plant in Texas, a plant that had 200 tons of ammonium nitrate exploded and killed 15 people,
I remember
including
that.
12 firefighters. So when that fire occurred, the fire chief correctly made the decision to evacuate an area a mile from the campus in the middle of the night, and that created a lot of consternation. But even after that, and then let the fire burn, and so there was a great deal of smoke around the campus. And the advice that was the most useful was, in that case, of what to do, which is what to not do. Don't go outside. You're actually better off indoors. This is not the day to try to push yourself to a new height on your fitness regime by how fast you can walk and how high you can get your heart rate. Not as good an idea. So giving people something to do, even if it's simple, can be really helpful. And I have an example of that from the recent Hurricane Helene experience here, where a state senator, Julie Mayfield, who's a representative of Asheville, had a daily post that she sent out to all of her constituents, and it said not just exactly those rules. Here's what we know about recovery. Here's what we don't know. Here are links to all of the different community agencies who are trying to provide assistance. And she also wrapped this in a context of encouraging people that things will get better, but it's going to take time, and encouraging patience and listening to and following the advice of public officials who are trying to give you that kind of advice on where to go and how to behave.
Yeah.
So,
Oh man, I thank you for that answer. I love I think at Often Wrong, we're all about admitting what you don't know. And there's so much humility in that, but I still see a lot of people failing to say, I don't know. I don't know, actually. Here are the gaps in our knowledge. Here's what we're doing to try and get that. XYZ person is better equipped to answer that than I am. I see more handoffs like that, but in like the briefings and whatnot in the wake of the LA fires, I've been watching a number of them. I've seen the handoff, but I think people are still reticent to say, we don't know that. We don't know that yet, because I'll also blame the 24-hour news cycle. Everyone's expecting people to put out information all the time. And it just doesn't change like that. We have an update when we have an update. So, it's interesting to me.
yeah, there was a wonderful model for that behavior that President Obama did once. There was a news conference, and I can't remember off the top of my head the topic. It was an attack at an airport or something like that, or some terrorist event, and he was having a press conference, and he was getting badgered by reporters about, what do you think, and he said, look, right now, I'm not going to say anything about this until I know what I'm talking about. And that's a really good model.
Yeah,
such a good model.
That.
I've seen that clip, actually. I know exactly what you're talking about. Like, what a beautiful way to say, I don't know what I'm talking about. Like, give me a minute until I do, and then I'll be able to answer.
And you're always better saying I don't know than the worst thing you could do is start making stuff up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Well, especially with a platform like that. Jeez.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly right.
No kidding. I can't even imagine how disastrous it would be if the president started sharing misinformation. I can't even imagine what that would look like. Really.
No. Of course not.
Oh
Maybe we'll see it in
man.
our
Yeah.
lifetime.
Especially, when it comes to like scientific literacy and so many of these places, we end up in having conversations that, the public discourse is obviously not going to be at the same level, anywhere near the same level of that, in the agencies, right? In the experts, who have these kinds of conversations. Like, even Stan, the conversations that you're able to have about the LA wildfires with your peers are different than what I'm able to have with my peers, And I think regardless, I think what you said about understanding compassion and empathy, we should all be able to do that regardless of the level of discourse, right?
That's correct. And among scientists themselves, that the best scientists are the ones who recognize that there are things you know, but there are a lot of things you don't know, and that part of science, and you mentioned this earlier, is discovering the things that you don't know, and the best scientists are the ones who say, you can rely, or they have scientific evidence, fully vetted, peer-reviewed, this kind of thing, to give certain points, but there are other things you simply don't know, and scientists spend a lot of time disagreeing with each other, and scientists are like the rest of us in the sense that, well, they're more disciplined than the rest of us, happily, but they're also like us in that values can influence the way in which you look at things, and this is an old example, but I will say that we had scientists at EPA and back in the early 1990s who were thinking about what caused air pollution, and generally the belief was that hydrocarbons were really the driver for creating ozone smog. But there was a dissident group that said, oh, wait, we're not giving enough attention to the role that nitrogen oxides play. And they turned out to be correct. But it took a long time for people who had built a career around one particular framing of the problem to recognize, oh, maybe that framing wasn't quite right. And fortunately, it was recognized in time to get that principle built into the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. But it was really, I remember sitting in a meeting in EPA where one of these folks who'd been pushing on hydrocarbons had just pushed and pushed and pushed. And then some scientists from Georgia Tech came in and said, and gave their evidence. And I could see his mind saying, oh, maybe I was wrong.
Oh,
I love that.
Oh, I
And
love
to
that.
great credit to him for being willing to be that open-minded. But it's not easy for us to do if we've been wedded to something that we just insisted was true, and then we find out that it's not requires a lot of discipline. But the best scientists know this. Anthony Fauci talked about that in connection with COVID, where initially said, oh, we don't think you need to wear masks, because they assumed that the transmission route was through dermal contact, when in fact it was through respiratory transmission.
Right. Yep. Oh, absolutely. I mean, this is all so resonant. Thank you, Stan. Lisa, did you want to take our next question?
Yes, I do. Okay, so this is what we have touched on this in so many different ways so far, but I am really curious. I know we are existing in this time with, as a result of climate change, as a result of, I don't know, incorrect choices by any given agency or person, we're going to experience a lot more environmental disasters coming up. We just had one so recently. Before you came on, we were talking about East Palestine. We were talking about the leak in Philadelphia. We were talking about the wildfires in Canada last year. There's just so many different things we could point to. But knowing that we've existed through so many of them, we don't seem to be, as a people, better at handling it. How would you suggest, in your experience, that people could prepare physically and also mentally for kind of living or kind of adjusting to this world that we live in now, where this is going to happen again and again in different ways, in new ways that we have not yet considered could happen?
That is a terrific question and a very difficult one. And we had this experience with Hurricane Helene up in western North Carolina this fall, where people had moved to Hurricane Helene to western North Carolina because they thought it was a refuge from some of the adverse impacts of climate change in terms of heat. And one of the things we learned is there is no refuge. That the effects of a changing climate can impact you pretty much no matter where you are. And I will distinguish this in saying these things about what individuals can do is to recognize that what individuals can do occurs in the context of a system. And part of the challenge I think we face is not only doing things that we can do, but thinking about the systems that result in constraining or expanding the range of choices that we actually have, and what do we need to do to influence systemic change as well as individually. But having said that, the first thing to do is simply to be aware, to understand and think about what are the risks that you have. For example, and again, I'll just pick on Winston-Salem, North Carolina. We do have the risk of being affected by tropical storms, which while we're a pretty fair distance from the coast here, a storm can come on shore and still have tremendous winds and rainfall and are more likely to have severe and extreme rainfall because of climate change, even when one moves on a particular path up through the center of North Carolina. And so in knowing that, to take the steps to try to prepare, to imagine that just because you don't see this every day, it doesn't mean you're not going to see it. What does this mean about around your home? What is this? Just as in California, what do you do to prepare vegetation around your home to make yourself less susceptible to fire? In North Carolina, what do you need to do about grading around your home to make sure that water is not can move freely around your home so you're not likely to be trapped? Or if you are likely to be trapped, think about that and maybe think about getting out of the location, the area earlier, and plan that before any kind of storm goes along. In fact, the best thing just in general is about preventive planning, that risk experts always encourage people to have a to-go kit, that if you really have to get up and go on a short notice, you can pick this up and have basic amounts of clothes and medications and things like that with you, so you don't have to be thinking about it and can move quickly. So those kind of preparations in terms of a real emergency are helpful for any household, as well as a plan that if you get separated, where will you try to reconvene, to stay connected, having appropriate batteries, those kind of, simple stuff. But it's important to do things you can do. But I want to come back to this point about systems, that if we're thinking, for example, about energy systems, that one of the things that is the most difficult is the failure to do long-term planning and to recognize that investments that you make in renewable energy, for example, will not only, even if they cost a little more now, they will give you more resiliency and save costs in the long run. And this balancing between long-term and short-term thinking is a hard thing for people to deal with. That very few of us, nobody likes to spend extra money, and if you feel like you're spending extra money for something where the benefits of it are only probable as opposed to certain, it's a harder choice to make. But those investments can really be almost literally life-saving.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's such a good point, and I've been thinking about that a lot recently. I remember
Yeah.
learning about like lead houses 10 years ago and
Yeah.
just being like, oh, one day I'm going to do that. But that also does bring up this other question where these long-term solutions do require this kind of significant upfront expense.
Yeah.
And I just want to think about, are there things that you know of, whether it's like programs or resources for people who don't have the means to make that investment right now, but who deserve to, just like everyone else does, but
Yeah.
what can they do?
Well, one of the efforts by the Biden administration in the Inflation Reduction Act is a fair number of those grants that went to EPA were to give to communities who otherwise would not otherwise have those means to invest in renewable energy solutions. And the purpose of those grants was to enable those communities to invest in those kind of solutions and make them accessible to people who would not otherwise have the means to do them, so that they could not only save money on the investment, but also save money in the long term with getting renewable energy, which would be cheaper in that community than just continuing to do your conventional things, or to make investments in energy efficiency and conservation, which is always the cheapest form of saving energy. Is the electron that's the cheapest is the one you don't have to use in the first place. So this is a case where, for the situation specifically you mentioned, government can play a very important role in making sure benefits to have better lives in the long run can be facilitated by investments up front.
Yeah.
I'm glad to know that. I'm going to do some research. Maybe we can put some links or things in
Yeah.
the
No,
description
that
of
was
this.
there's EPA and the Inflation Reduction Act got a significant amounts of grant funds, and the agency has been working very hard over the last year, especially to get those funds out so they could be put to work on the ground. It takes time. The government money doesn't just appear the moment the Congress passes the bill and the president signs it, and there's a long process for getting these funds done. But they've been distributed to many areas now, and accessing those funds is something that's really important, especially for less advantaged communities.
Yeah. That's great. That's great to hear. Thank you, Stan. I think in going back to the discourse element around environmental disasters, and I guess like focusing on the during, I remember watching coverage of name a hurricane, growing up. And until recently, it felt like a lot of times people on the right would say, no, now's not the time to talk about climate change. We're in the midst of this disaster. We can't talk about climate change. And it was like, it's insensitive to talk about climate change. This isn't not even, whatever. It feels like that has relatively dissipated in public discourse and in the media. I just don't see it as much. We're in kind of a newer place that is, we acknowledge it. Are we, what are we doing in certain places? But like, I think there's a lot more baseline acknowledgement around, the facts and realities of climate change. But now, it's interesting. In the wake of the LA fires, what I've seen is there's discourse from the left, saying, well, no, now's not the time to talk about politics. It's not the time to talk about how public officials are handling this. Now's not the time to talk about that. And I think there's been a lot of things on both sides. So I'm not saying, it's one way or the other, but it's interesting to me that the discourse, it just feels like people are capitalizing on, it's insensitive to talk about this now on, whatever it seems. I'd love your thoughts on that.
No, thank you. I actually have a pretty strong opinion about this, which is that getting into the middle of the blame game in the middle of the disaster is really never helpful. There's going to be time enough for postmortems after the disaster occurs, but doing that when you're in the middle of it, when usually the people involved in directing things are doing the best, the dead level best that they can.
Yeah.
And they're operating with incomplete information, always with incomplete information. And the best thing you can do is to try to give a little bit of grace to people who are doing the best that they can with the information and resources they have.
Yeah.
It's important to go back afterwards when you do an after-action review and say, this didn't go well. Why didn't it go well? What's the root cause? What can we do to fix it? What can we learn from this experience? So that should always be, people should not be defensive during a postmortem review. But at the same time, in the middle of the disaster, that's not really very helpful. I do think, again, it's important, and it's important because disasters oftentimes bring out in a very vivid way root system failures that people have kind of known about for a long time, but it's there's a million other things you got to deal with and all these crises, and you kind of just put it off, and a disaster kind of puts it square in the face and say, yes, we have to deal with this. We have to figure out in Los Angeles, what do we mean about zoning? What do we mean about what do we mean about areas where you have high risks of wildfires? And this is going to be exacerbated, of course, by thinking about insurance, which is going to be very much in the news now, and rightly so, because insurers are some of the ones who are the biggest immediate indicators of responses to climate change, because they recognize these risks that exist, and many of them have become very reluctant to invest in those risks. So, but I think that the real thing to stress is not to say that you shouldn't do a postmortem. You absolutely should, but the time to do that is after you've got the fires out, and you can go back and do a review about what worked and what didn't work, and try to be ruthlessly objective about that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. I think, it's interesting, like, on some level, you're never going to be able to control and shape the narrative that everyone takes and runs with, but, even like watching these press briefings, some of the questions being asked are, they're all inflammatory in a sense, and targeted at, what's happening. Like the LA wildfires, they at present are still happening. Like it's a long run to put out a fire. And there's not a moment where it's like, oh, it's out. Like we're done. That just doesn't happen. And so there are firefighters and plenty of other people, relief folks, first responders, et cetera, putting their lives at risk still. And so to me, it does make sense that like, we got to get through it. We're doing the best we can, and we shouldn't distract. But, the public is still going to have the discourse, right? The public is still going to talk.
But you cannot sort of reinforce that, but simply say, we understand that this is something we'll want to go back and review what we could have done better. But in the meantime, the first urgency is actually getting the fire out, or at least getting the fires back under a reasonable control. And that reminds me of another point, though, is that on your point about how people do now have a different narrative about extreme weather and hurricanes and things like this, that you now see that I think meteorologists have really been talking about this for years, and it is making its way into a common narrative. And one of the most influential people there are the people who do the local weather, because you will say, look, very few meteorologists will want to say this hurricane was caused by climate change. The language they will use is the existence of a changing climate, hotter ocean temperatures, hotter atmospheric temperatures, more energy in the weather systems, the greater likelihood that this means you'll get extreme rain as well as extreme winds. So these make these the likelihood is, and the probabilities increase significantly that storms that form will spin up more quickly, that they are exacerbated by climate change, that they will have these kind of effects. So you don't try to get into the trap of did climate change cause this storm, but you could say, what you can say is that the probabilities of storms like this are exacerbated by our changing climate. And so therefore, when you think about what do you do in response, the system response, we need to prepare our communities to be more resilient in anticipation of the fact that storms like this are possible. And in Asheville, they're going to be having that conversation right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, that's such a good point. I've been saying that for many years. Like, this is maybe 5 years ago, I had an idea of like putting together a coalition of meteorologists and helping just improve their climate change literacy. And, meteorologists are incredibly specially trained folks and they know how to talk about those things, but you can't make that claim. You can't say, well, this was climate change, folks. This was exactly this. And, you can't do that for a few reasons. But like you said, shaping the narrative around it and tying it in, I think we've seen so much more of that. And yeah, shout out to the local meteorologists who have especially done an excellent job of that. I think that's huge. But it's fascinating to see where we kind of end up with all this. And I think to double back on, I guess, my point with the public discourse, there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of frustration and sadness and, grief at every level. And I think when your public officials are right there, when the climate change boogeyman is right there, when the, whatever you can stick it to is right there, people are going to do that, and it's easier to point at those things than really say, okay, let's wait. Let's process our grief. Let's process our fear. Let's understand that this is scary and ongoing. I don't think people have the capacity to do that. And I don't think the media helps,
No,
what it engenders.
The sort of, as you mentioned, the 24-hour news cycle where you want to have people shoving microphones in front of people's faces, asking them for an immediate answer is not very helpful. But it's kind of like a sugar high, that those kind of things of where you want to blame somebody may be sort of a short run satisfying, but they're not ultimately satisfying. I think most people are wise enough to recognize that, the simple answer is not always the right answer.
Yeah.
And that it takes sort of constant focus and repetition on the part of responding officials in a disaster like the LA wildfires to sort of keep focused on the what do you know, what don't you know, what are you doing to find out, what you can do, and being transparent about those things is really, if you can do that on a regular cycle, eventually people start to come around and say, okay, I think we get it, and try to move forward and get away from the sort of this need for this sort of sugar high fix of, I'm going to blame XYZ person, whoever it is.
Well, that's a question that I was having looking at all of this, and I'm glad you mentioned the 24-hour news cycle again, because I think this has a lot to do with it. But I feel like because we have this environmental disaster, and then everyone who's even tangentially related will be asked their opinion, and everyone's speaking up. And I think that might be causing some of this, because people in moments like this want to look to someone, and then you're being presented with 1,000 experts on any given thing. And so I'm wondering, who is it that we're supposed to look to? Because for some of them, say, you might not like how the mayor responded to that, but is the mayor actually the right person that we're supposed to be looking to in the moment of an environmental disaster? Or are they there for other things? It's hard for, I think, most people to know who is the one that we want to get our answers from.
Yeah.
Yes, and the answer, unfortunately, to that question is going to be it depends. We don't live in an environment where we can all turn to Walter Cronkite, who is the official spokesperson for like I did when I was your age. That's kind of what people did, and that world is gone. So it will depend, and if you are involved in leading one of these responses, one of your jobs is to say who is the most credible person that people are most likely to listen to. Now, no one will be the person that everyone will want to listen to, and it's not like you can put the 1,000 news sources genie back in the bottle. But you would like to try, again, especially for officials who are having to do this, to find the person who is the most who is the most credible and who is going to be the most effective in trying to convey this sense of, what we know, what we don't know, here's what you can do, and do it in a clear and convincing way. And so, it might not be you. It might not be the mayor. It might be the fire chief, or it might be somebody else who's involved as an emergency response leader. But that's a very important decision for leaders of a response to make, is who is the person who's the face, the public face, to go back to our earlier conversation, the public face who people trust as a communicator.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, it's a hard thing to have to parse through who it is, but like, I know who my people have been. The local fire chiefs have been incredible in providing updates. LAFD has been, working tirelessly, obviously, but even, certain, city officials and representatives of certain areas, like state level representatives who, the folks from Altadena have been doing an incredible job of briefing people and being really, really comprehensive in here's where we are, here's the resources we need, here's what we don't have, here's, that kind of thing. But it's very hard to parse through all of the different, narratives, the different people, all of it. And, I think the media doesn't do us any favors trying to, I even think, like, sometimes we get a hero, sometimes we get a Steve Kornacki, if you will, single person who is just trusted and great. And, I think that's rare. And for me, it was Brian Williams growing up. But, anything Brian Williams said, I was like, okay, Brian Williams. But, a lot of folks, it's local news. A lot of folks, it's their TikTok feed, or not anymore.
Right. Given the Supreme Court decision today.
Yep. Yeah. So to me, it's I think the best thing we can do is educate and support and help people make the best decisions they can for themselves, and hope that leads them to the right place.
Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. That's a pretty good summary.
Oh, thank you.
Look at you, Claire.
Thanks. Oh, look at me. Oh gosh, it's that Wake Forest education, I tell you.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh man, that's great. Well, Lisa, any other questions from your perspective?
Okay, so my question is really just about, we talked a little bit about what you can do physically to prepare yourself in the event of an environmental disaster, but I'm thinking more so just, and I have to be broad because I don't know what the answer to this question is going to be, but what are maybe 3 things that we could all be doing to be, more informed, more supportive, less a part of the problem, and yeah, what can we do going forward to prepare ourselves?
Well, and the 3 things that occur to me are, first of all, to simply be educated, because the answer to that question will depend on where you are. You can be educated about what are things around you. Just like at Wake Forest, people will never forget now that they used to be a mile from a fertilizer plant. And the obvious question is, what else is there where risks may occur? And it's the responsibility of Wake Forest to think about that. And people will think about it now in a way that they never used to before. And so being aware, and for individuals, it's, what am I near? Am I near a petroleum tank farm? Am I near a rail line where they're transporting hazardous chemicals? And think about, what would I do if you had, the unthinkable might actually occur? And that's a bit of a scary thing to do, but it also will help you sort of come to terms with it and sort of recognize what the things you could be better aware of. A second thing, though, is not to over-dramatize the risks that one of the people involved in risk communications note that there's some risks that we accept on a regular basis. That if you ask people, is airline travel more dangerous or driving your car more dangerous, people often say airline travel, even though the statistics simply do not back that up, that the most dangerous thing you do during the course of the day is get in your car. And to recognize that there are risks, but not all risks are equal, and to frame them in your minds about what are things that you really could spend time being thoughtful about, and what are things that are probably not the most urgent. Because Could an airplane crash on my house? Sure. Is that very likely? No, probably not. I'm probably better invested in spending my time thinking about how we would be prepared if, in fact, there were a tropical storm that came through that dumped significant amounts of rain on Winston-Salem the same way it happened in Asheville, and what does that mean for where I am and what I would need to prepare to do. And the third is simply to really, I have to say this, engage in public policy. The issues about how we handle different risks, whether it's risks for chemicals in drinking water or risks of air pollution or even risks of disruption of ecosystems, occur all the time. And the best citizens are ones who are active and engaged, who do in fact educate themselves, and then write your local officials, write your state legislator. The nice thing about environmental catastrophes or risks is there are very few people who are in favor of environmental catastrophes. And if the question is how do we better prepare ourselves to deal with environmental catastrophes, encourage your local officials to make the investment in doing planning, because the best thing that people can do in preparation for a disaster is to prepare for it. We used to say that the thing you don't want to be doing in the emergency response world is exchanging business cards with other fellow responders in the parking lot of the disaster. People do exercises. You build relationships so that you get to know the other people with whom you'll be in the tent if the train derails or the particular plant explodes, and you encourage your officials to invest in that kind of preparation work so that when something happens, which it will happen sooner or later, they're ready. They're better prepared. So those are the things I would point to.
Wow. I mean, I think these are great answers. Honestly, that is one big thing that I started realizing. I used to be really involved and interested in local government and things like that. And you don't realize how many little big decisions are being made on your block every day.
Well, I can't agree with you more on that. And in fact, one of the great losses we've had in journalism has been the loss of coverage of local events and affairs. And just what goes on in your county council makes a big difference in your life.
Yes,
sometimes much more so than what's going on in the White House or in Congress.
Federal level, absolutely. We're big fans of local government over here, and
you should
Yeah.
be. That's where individual voices really can make a difference. So
Absolutely.
if you go to a council meeting and in the comment period you stand up, people listen to that. People pay
Yep.
attention. It's really important.
Yep, absolutely. I write to my state house and state senate representatives a little often. I'm not going to say I bug them because they haven't told me that, and I like to think I'm charming over email. But I reach out to them a lot, and they always respond, or someone from their office does. And I'm making sure that they know, it matters to me that they're investing in, for instance, wildlife crossings over our interstates in the state of Colorado and California. I'm registered in Colorado though, so that's where I reach out. But it's important. So thank you for that. Absolutely.
Well, no, I can't speak to it from the perspective of an elected official, but I can speak to it as someone who's been an official, and there is nothing more gratifying than to get really thoughtful, informed feedback from a member of the public about something that you're worried about and you aren't quite sure what to do. That's immense, or looking for guidance. That's immensely helpful.
Yeah, that's great. That's such a great perspective. Oh, Stan, thank you so much. Lisa, do you have any other questions for Stan?
I do. One more
Please.
question here. Okay, so this podcast, we're really big on connecting issues because they're all connected, as far as I can tell. I could be wrong. But if we're looking outside of climate change specifically, or disaster preparedness, what else do you think intimately ties with this subject that, working towards betterment of a different area will also positively affect us here?
I can think of two things. One is thinking about what is sometimes called the circular economy, because many of our long-term exposures are a result of an economic system that is sort of what Ray Anderson used to call take, make, waste, where you extract a product, do something with it, and then when its useful life is done, it goes into a landfill, something like that, as opposed to a more circular design where products are manufactured and used, but then at the end of their useful life, they can be returned back into a cycle to create new products. And you have, that's again, the circular economy concept, which is an important issue from design. And that's the sort of thing you'd like to see more embedded as a principle in our economic systems, and that these economic systems create incentives to reward that kind of behavior. The other one is ecosystem protection, and I know I touched briefly on this earlier, but ecosystems perform immensely valuable functions for the earth. It's often described as wetlands are nature's kidneys, and that's an excellent use. And and in North Carolina, if you had forested areas, they were less likely to experience this complete dramatic runoff that you got in Hurricane Helene than areas that have been influenced by buildup of urban areas where you have faster movement of water through the systems, which goes down into channels, creates big floods, and creates tremendous damage. And thinking about the kinds of ecosystems that we need to protect, not just for species, as important as that is, because it's tremendously important, but it's also important for human beings because the ecosystem service benefits we get from those ecosystems are immense. And so those are two areas that I think I would really like to encourage people moving forward in their long-term thinking to think about how to build more circular economies and how to protect some of these valuable ecosystems that provide us with tremendous benefits.
Beautiful answer.
That
I love
was
that.
exceptional, Stan. Thank you. That was so helpful.
The
And
mind reels.
yes, yeah, I mean, really, thank you. That was a wonderful, wonderful answer. And I just want to thank you so much again for being here today. And, you've given us so much to think about and chew on. And, I think there's just so much here. And honestly, I'm excited to watch this conversation back and learn
know, me
even
too.
more. So thank you. Thank you, Stan.
Well, Claire and Lisa, I'm just so grateful for the opportunity to be here. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much for joining
you
us.
so
This has
much.
been such a joy, and yeah, what an honor to speak with you today.
Yeah.
It's completely my pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks, Stan. Wow. I just feel like that was such a wonderful conversation with Stan. And
Me as Lisa Nwankwo, I never thought that I could possibly be so endeared by a former government agency professional. So that was astounding. I am blown
I
away.
know. I know. He has a way of explaining things with a humanity, but also just, when I think of a bureaucrat, I don't think of Stan, but maybe I will now. I think of Stan as like front and center human being, salt of the earth kind of guy. And I mean, regardless, what a wonderful guest to have. And I so appreciate him joining us.
I'm so
That's
glad
great.
he came. That was so special. I feel like, yeah, we could have gone on forever, but he's so concise. What a wealth of information he has.
I know. He's wonderful.
One thing that Stan said that wasn't recorded, but I think is so funny and perfect for our show, is he was saying that he used to say about his daughter, sometimes wrong, but never in doubt. And I've never felt more seen by a quote in my life.
I love it.
I could
so
be
much.
wrong, but I'm confidently wrong.
Yeah. I love him. It was so
know.
great. And I really appreciate him taking the time to talk about all that and to give us that excellent quote. And we will carry that with us, Stan, absolutely. But
One more
I
thing-
think,
Sorry. I don't mean to cut you off.
no, I cut you off a lot. I cut everyone off a lot. Go ahead, please.
Well, honestly, the thing I just wanted to bring this up again because we talked about this engaging in local government thing, and I just want to drive that home. When I was living in Brooklyn, I would remember reading about like the block captains, and I think this is, at least it's true in New York, but you can look up the public meeting notes for all of your local government officials. I remember reading this one thing about just like the e-bikes in the neighborhood and if we were going to allow them in our neighborhood. And I know it seems like so silly and small, but that's a room of like 5 people making this decision, and all of these decisions ladder up. And I think something Stan was saying too about how it's really gratifying to get these like thoughtful letters from people, because otherwise you just have your random neighbor who's just making decisions based on the best of their knowledge, and the best of their knowledge might not be that good.
Totally.
Maybe we all need to contribute.
Yes. Yeah. And I'll just double down on what you said. My faith in the federal government has never been lower.
For
and
real.
well, I mean, it's been pretty damn low for a long time.
I don't even think it's on the chart anymore.
It's not really, but it's kind of freeing in a sense, to be
Yeah.
honest. And I know you and I both kind of felt that way, but I can't say what a big fan I am of local government at like the city level, the county level, like true, and the state level also. You know, like
But then you still have
governors.
sometimes where
Yeah.
people are saying like, write to your congressperson. But we
Oh,
have
yeah.
seen over and over again that the congress people will let their mailboxes be full. They're not going to read their emails. And yeah.
Well, and to be clear, like when I say the state level, I mean like state level officials, not the state representatives at
Yeah.
the federal level. So like, I mean, in Colorado, our attorney general, our governor, like great people who really are engaged in the community. And, you know, regardless of like where you agree on what they've done or not, like they are Colorado people and
Mhm.
they really care about, you know, the folks in our state. And it's nice to see that. And to me, it's what government should be. And because, you know, our states, our cities, everything's smaller, it is more participatory. It's a
Totally.
better, you know, representation of the people, I think. Not in all cases, of course, but
Yeah. But I also
Amen.
feel like the higher up you get in the government, the more it becomes like, oh, is this like Republican or like Democratic? And
yeah,
but I feel like the lower down is just about the people, which it's all supposed to be about. Don't get me wrong.
Totally.
But it is more true at
Yeah.
your like in your city.
I agree. Well, and okay, to bring this back to Stan, I'm really grateful that he allowed us to get a better understanding of like the conversations we should be having and the ones that we are during crises and after. I think especially what he was saying about the postmortems. You know, I think if we reliably had postmortems that people felt like they were a part of, not just like internet discourse ranting. I mean, not even discourse on the internet ranting, and social media. And, you know, but actually had, hey, we're going to have a postmortem and we're going to take accountability for the things that should have been done differently then. And then we learn from it. It's something that like needs to keep happening as it's going. But like, I agree, especially with something when it's like a catastrophic event that you're in the middle of and like lives are at risk and it's literally just about mitigation and safety. That's all that matters at that time.
Totally. Also, I will say this is definitely something that I already do, but I think I'm going to take this role more seriously. Is that maybe the right thing to do is be the receipt collector. I am noting what everyone's saying and when and why, and I'm available for comment later when everyone's safe. I know we're not supposed to say safe. Stan mentioned that.
Yeah, we're
I
not
messed up
supposed to.
already.
Well,
But-
we're not really the media. We're kind of not.
Chat, is this media?
Yeah.
I need to know.
Is this media? I guess it's technically media, but we're not media.
Yeah, totally.
Like,
I'm just a
how
girl.
could we be?
Mhm.
We can't be. But I love that. I love that role. I love that
to
role
do
for
it.
you.
I'm happy
Yeah.
to serve.
Yeah, well, and you know, there's obviously like in the fallout from the wildfires in Los Angeles, there's going to be a lot of, I mean, there are already so many calls for political reform and changes and, you know, changes in the mayor's office, et cetera. And, you know, I think there needs to be a lot of accountability taken afterwards.
Mhm.
And, you know, obviously it doesn't really it doesn't really serve us if it just gets swept under the rug. And it can't be. Like LA is going to be
No.
living with this for decades and it's going to keep coming up. So as soon as we get through the disaster, we do need to have, you know, really productive conversations about what's going to be done differently.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thanks to Stan for joining us today. What a lovely guest.
Yes.
I love doing this podcast. I'm so excited to have more people on.
Me too.
And to ask all the questions.
The rest of this season, it's going to be so good. And we just have so many good conversations ahead. And I feel, very lucky that we can explore a lot of really hard and sad spaces with the lens of learning and curiosity and respect and, in many ways, just seeking understanding because that's, I don't know, that's just how I like to live. And, I don't think we have to tamp down our enthusiasm for, good conversation, even if it's about the hard things.
Totally.
But yeah, I think it's good. So,
well,
thank you, Lisa.
As always, on every single episode, please do not forget to give us your feedback. Did you love it? Did you hate it? Did we get something wrong? Did we get it so right? I really love validation. I definitely want to hear about that. So you can do that on our website. You can do that on our social media, for which the links will be on whatever platform you're listening to us on. Just let us know. What did we get wrong? What did we miss? What did we not make a big enough deal out of? What did we overblow? Do you have an additional question for Stan?
Yes.
Let us know. We'd love to hear.
Let us know. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back next time on Often Wrong.
Bye.
Bye.